Welcome everybody to Getting APIs to Work. Today we'll talk about improving API specifications with stories, creating useful APIs. Mike, what does that mean?
Well, there's a lot in that title, right? We talked about this. There's a lot of APIs out there, but a lot of them, we've talked about this before, are not always useful. We talk about usability and all those other kinds of things, but we need to improve the specification of APIs in a way that sort of applies. You got jobs to be done by Clayton Christensen and all these things. What's the problem we're really trying to solve? And I think we really need to improve. We can improve the way we create our APIs by just speaking more about, like, what is it we're trying to solve? Who's the audience? What is the data we're trying to do? What are the, having a sort of a methodology. And this methodology has come up several times as a kind of like a set of storytelling or user stories. Like you've experienced this kind of thing before, right? What is this idea of a story?
Yeah, the idea of a story, and any idea of a story in that space, I think, does need to come with an idea of value, right? What is the value that I create?
Value.
For me, that's kind of the main point here. I've seen so many APIs that are usable, right, that are nicely designed on a technical level, but where when you think about, well, who's going to use that and why exactly, it's really hard to find an answer for that. And I think I've seen so many places where the scales seem to tip a little bit too far over to just make it usable and not even think about so much about is it even useful. And that's really, I think, where it's an interesting thing to think about. What is it that I'm even designing here?
So is this sort of almost the reverse of the if you build it they will come? Like that if you build it they will come is sort of like, well, I'll just put anything up there and people will just start using it. Well, that's not really true. They use it if it solves a problem. But are you sort of saying, well, it's highly usable, like it's friendly and I've got lots of documentation, but it doesn't actually do what I want? Is that sort of what you're saying?
I guess so. I think that if you build it, they will come. To some extent, it still applies to if you build it and it's useful, they will come.
Yeah.
Right. So
yeah.
if you build it and nobody needs it, they will not come. And I think that's what we see a fair bit. At least that's what I see a fair bit happening, where the assumption is that it's an API, so we were told we should do APIs, so that's what we do. And then we were also told to be really careful, is it a get or a post? So we do this.
Yeah.
That's kind of the focus then, right? And I think there's this piece missing there where sometimes I think thinking a little bit more first about the value, like your value proposition, basically, right? That is where we are kind of, as a community, I think sometimes we have a little bit of a blind spot.
So that's what I'm asking. So what is that value? How do you know what the value of an API is? Like, how do you discover that?
That's a good point. And I would say, right, that a story is a good way to demonstrate that value. That you could say, if somebody wants, let's say, to find customers with a certain profile and a certain history, here is how they can do it. And then the story isn't overly complicated, right? The story isn't like, oh, they have to go to these 85 databases and combine things in that way. And then it works, right? The story should be more like, well, you go here, you specify your criteria, and you get that list. And that is, I think, how you can demonstrate value, right? By having like a succinct story that tells you this is how somebody had a problem, and here is what they were doing, and then their problem was solved, and they were happy.
So you're talking about stories. You're talking about user stories. Like user stories go back all the way to Kent Beck and Extreme Programming and Alistair Coburn's Detroit project. Like that's like the late 90s, early aughts, right? So there's this thing called user story, right? Is that what we need? Is that what you think?
I think so. I think user stories were like, I mean, they were like the first version of really focusing on the user and not just on let's build a system that does stuff without really spending a lot of thought on how it solves problems for people.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think that we're still sometimes more in that phase of let's just build things that do stuff, and we're not really focusing on the people again enough, right? And I think that is what happened a lot during that time. And I think maybe it's about time that we think about the same kind of thing for the API space.
Right. I think that's a really good observation, right? Is when you think about it, Ron Jeffries and Kent Beck and all these other things, that's 20 years ago, right? That's around the same,
least, yes.
Yeah, that's around the same time that Fielding's writing about REST and all this other kind of stuff, and the web is becoming really important. It all sort of happens around that same time frame. So, I remember there was like the card system, right? You'd write things down on a card, like a feature on a card or something like that. Conversation confirmation. I think that's Ron Jeffries. But these are all the notion of focusing on, like you said, what is the story? What is it people want to do? Before you get excited about get and post and URL and body and all that nonsense, what is the value that you're trying to capture or trying to create with a good story? And I think applying that idea to APIs is an excellent idea.
And the other thing that I see a lot is that there's still in many organizations, there still is a pretty big gap between like the business side and the IT side, right? So that the APIs are still kind of very much on the IT side of things, and the business folks don't really care that much. And I think the stories, they give us a good way to talk about an API's value in less technical terms, right? And say, here is what people can achieve using this thing, and you don't have to dive all the way down to HTTP request methods, but you understand what somebody gets out of that. And I think that is an important thing to understand about an API. What do people get out of it?
Yep, I think that's really good, especially that notion of a wider audience, like a story. Like, we're sort of wired for stories. So if you have a story, I think of it as sort of the elevator pitch for your API. If you can get people all throughout the company, if you get people in the C-suite to tell your story, then you know that you're going to have a successful API. So I think that's a really good point of view, is to think about it in terms of like a wider audience that's non-technical. It reminds me of our friend Gregor Hoppe. Gregor tells that great little anecdote. He has this line that says, a phrase you never hear at Google is, well, let's go talk to IT about that.
Yeah.
Because business and IT are, already, they're the same, right? So this idea of story is a way of sort of bridging some of that gap, right?
I like the idea of or calling it an elevator pitch. One idea I had was to also say, if you had those kind of things, it would be great to, let's say, every week or so, you would have like a company pitch of, the API of the week, where you would just, tell people, look, this thing is available. Whoever wants to build something on top of that, here is, what it does for you. Oh, and if you can actually have that in a way that everybody understands it, and not just the IT folks, I think then people start understanding better what are the building blocks that we even have that we can kind of take into account when we think about new ideas.
That takes it to a whole nother level. So I was thinking of like pitching so that you get funding for building your API. You've kind of taken it to a whole nother level, which is, we have all these APIs. Let's have this sort of regular pitch experience with like, see what you can do with this API. That's actually a very, very cool. It's a sort of an internal hack kind of thing, or an internal kind of project. I like that idea. Have you done that? Have you seen this before?
No, I have not seen this before,
I like this idea.
But I'm trying to pitching it a little bit, saying like, look, if your goal is to have more and more APIs, people will start losing track. That's just how it is.
Yeah.
But if you make it easy to understand what they do, at least they might have some memory of, oh, I remember hearing about I can do this and that, and I can get to this kind of information and whatever. And then maybe they get some interesting new ideas how to use that capability to build cool new stuff.
I love it. Okay, so let's get right to it. So, what is the story?
Your story, yeah. Let's get right to it. So you have already written about that, right? So the whole thing, like you said, is essentially it is an old concept. User stories have been around for a long time, and you recently published a book about designing and building great web APIs. And in there, you also talk about API stories. And what I really like about that is that for you, it really is these sequence of steps, right? First, you work on your story and you think about what is the value. And then you model it and say, okay, and now that I've kind of proven or documented how it creates value, now I get to design the thing, and I hopefully also create a good design. But first, I make sure it's actually useful.
Yeah.
So tell us a little bit about that API story approach that you're taking in your book.
Right. So I borrowed a lot from the original idea, the original Connextra story concept, which is the as a role, I want to X, I need Y kind of thing. But I have a sort of a slightly worked up version. So what I say is come up with a purpose statement, and that's sort of like your one-liner. Like our role is to improve, the efficiency of the database, or to reduce the amount of time it takes for the customer to get the answer to a question or something. Like that's what the the feature of the API role is.
So that's kind of the mission statement.
Yeah, exactly right. It's the mission statement, and you can use this mission statement as the API if it ends up in production. When somebody says we should add a feature, you can say, is that really part of the mission statement of this API? You can use it. It has life. But the mission statement, so I call it a purpose. And then the next one is, what is the data that we deal in? Like I need to be managing, given name and family name or address objects or whatever the data elements. So be specific about what data it is you're going to be passing and managing. And then the other one is the actions. What do I want to allow people to do? People need to find all the customers that have this particular profile, like you were talking about before, or I need to be able to read or write or filter or share or approve, like all those verby things. But again, writing them all in a narrative kind of, prose style, not writing them about HTTP or post or get or anything. So coming up with these things, the purpose, the data, and the actions are key. Occasionally you need, and in the example that I use, you might have a processing rule. Like if you give me this information, I'll compute the net present value and give you the payment schedule back. That's like a promise that you might think about it that way. And then the other one is there may be a rule which basically says no two records can have the same end date or something like that, or some other rules that you enforce on the interface. Because this is about APIs. So purpose, data, actions, processing, and rules. That's sort of my collection. That's much more than Kent Beck and Jeffries and Coburn's original story. But for me, that gives me a lot to deal with, as you said before, to then go back and start to model. So that's the way I think about it. How about you? Have you done similar things like this?
Not really in that kind of systematic style. And typically, I think what I tell people is maybe a little bit more to also have like workflows, like whole series of interactions where you say, if I want to get this done, if I want to order something, like here's the sequence of steps to go through. So, and to some extent, I think we both have the same idea. So I'm guessing that your structure lends itself pretty well then to use as a starting point for modeling resources and these kind of things, right? Interactions with those resources and so forth.
Yep.
When I talk about workflows, I think the thing that I have in mind, of course, is often hypermedia, right? It's like, what is the kind of workflow guided by links that I can design at least as the happy path through the API. And so I think we're both like a little bit biased, so to speak, in terms of thinking, we really need this stuff, then designing becomes easier.
Yep. And I will say that so I have this I talk about it in the book, this collection of assets that you should have, and story is one of them, and model is another one, vocabulary is one of them. Diagram is also another one, which has that kind of action in it. So I think we're all kind of we're both thinking about the same kind of general space of what you're going to need before you start coding. But I think the story is so important. So I think you're like going back to the title, right? Improving the API specification with stories. So like collecting this information and jotting all this down, even though it's in narrative form, is going to improve the API that the specification and the API you create, and actually make it more useful, right?
Yes, and more understandable. I have a lot of discussions with people who say, everybody should be able to kind of at least read OpenAPI. And to some level, I agree, not everything, but like just understand what's in there, and like at least understand what the resources are and so forth, just the kind of the rough interaction level. But even then, even if you can read that at this level, it doesn't really tell you much what do I get out of it, right? It just tells you, well, here's a bunch of resources and here are the methods you can do. So I think it takes a lot of mental effort to just figure out what the thing is actually proposing to do for me. And therefore, I think these stories, in particular, what I really like is the mission statement. I really like that, right? That's like the perfect one-liner, so to speak. If you first encounter the API, right, it should just tell you, and here's the reason I exist.
Yep, I think that's right. And then that helps you even when you start to build out your portal of APIs, right? So one of the other things that you've been so good about is you talk about this idea of landscape, and you've got all these APIs. How do I find the one I'm looking for? So I think, using stories as part of your documentation kit that you post into the portal system, into the search system, means that if I start to search for phrases like customers and profiles and all these other things, then it's going to surface the APIs that I could be looking for. And it makes it much easier for me to find out that, Eric's team's already built this API. I can just use this. So I think there's added value, just as I talked before about the mission statement helps you as you do maintenance on the API. We talk about in the continuous API book, we talk about that cycle of realization and maintenance and deprecation and all that. So I think that helps. And at the same time, it helps the searchability, the findability, the discoverability when you get this vast ecosystem, especially if you've got people from various parts of the country or the world contributing to your ecosystem in large enterprises, right?
I like all of these things, but actually, from my perspective, one of the most important aspects where I think it also helps, and which might be one of the most valuable ones, would be just to make sure that teams think about this before they start jumping right into design, right? Really think about, how am I creating value with this API? Who is it for? How are they getting value out of it? Is it relatively easy for them? At least, is it going to be useful? And I think that part is just something where oftentimes it's just skipped. And then after that, like you can optimize your portal all you want. If the APIs that are in the portal are just not very useful, then you're kind of done, right?
Yeah. That's a really, really good point. So that takes it all home, right? This is really about improving the specifications for creating useful APIs. It's creating useful APIs is what this is about, right?
Yep, and give me your elevator pitch, right? If your elevator pitch is, well, we have that database and we thought we'll publish that column, that's not going to get you any funding.
Yeah, right. It's not exciting me in any way, right? Yeah. No. I'm off the elevator. That's it.
Yeah, exactly. I might look for better stories somewhere.
That's right. Yeah.
So I think we've actually covered almost all of it, but we did start with talking a little bit about useful and usable. And I think we have a really nice segue into the continuation of this. So today we'll do a cliffhanger. And So you have your stories chapter, which is about useful APIs, and then next time we'll talk about usable. So what will that be about?
So now there's this. What is this difference? It may be a useful thing, but can I actually use it?
Plus, what's the combination, right? We had this, right? It's like if it's useful but not usable, is that better or worse when it's not useful but usable? And ideally, it should be both. And anyway,
right, I'm looking forward to this.
Anyway, so.
Yes. Okay. Very good.
Thanks, Mike, for joining once again. I think this has been another very interesting topic, API stories. I hope everything writes them. I hope everybody has a mission statement for their APIs. If not, think about it. I think that alone might be a really educational exercise.
There you go. I agree 100%.
Thanks, everybody, for watching. And until next time, when we will talk about usable APIs.
All right.
Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.